How the hell didn't I know who I was? Really, how absurd that I could have possibly imagined that I was English, that I was the same as my colleagues. Totally absurd.
Do you also harbor injury and hurt against Arab states?
It's shameful. It's shameful. On what basis would they be watching? Are the Palestinians not fellow Arabs? How can you watch children starving when you've got so much money? What if Israel flattened Gaza? Just simply flattened it. Who would intervene? That was something I wrote before October 7th. In order for the US to be nice to you, you had to be nice to Israel. The thing that was so shocking was that my colleagues and friends were clapping and congratulating Israel and saying, good for you, carry on, give them a kicking, them being the Arabs.
What can you remember of that period in 1948?
Nobody had any time for a child saying, when are we going home? What is happening? That, in the end, led to this genocide, because that doesn't come out of nowhere. You can only do that to people whom you have for a very long time considered to be non-people. Surely you don't put out 1.5 hours.
Actually, it's very well seen. Actually, the like 2-hour podcasts are the most seen podcasts we have.
What?
Yes.
I'm amazed.
Okay, great. We'll start soon. 3, 2, 1. Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm extremely honored today to have in studio with me Ghada Karmi. Ghada, welcome to the show.
Welcome to you.
Ghada is a very well-known Palestinian writer and activist. She was also a 9-year-old child when the Nakba occurred. And so today we're going to speak to her to get her story and her thoughts on a very tragic and another unfolding Nakba that's occurring right now in Gaza. So it's going to be a somber and tragic conversation. But Ghada, we can't wait to actually hear from you and learn from you. And thank you for making your time available to us today.
Okay, thank you.
Ghada, just to sort of start us off, I just mentioned that you sort of are a survivor from the Nakba. That occurred 77 years ago. We are now seeing the unfolding of another Nakba. What do you think, how will this live in the memory of people 77 years from now? How will what's unfolding now live in the memory of the Palestinians in Gaza and other Palestinians around the world, in your thoughts, 77 years from now?
Well, look, one thing is clear. We don't know what's going to happen. So, in a way that if I give an answer now, we're still in the middle of this horror, of this nightmare. This may not be the same answer that I might give whenever it's over. So we need to have that proviso in mind. With that proviso in mind, I can only imagine that, say, for example, if it ended now, today, how would it be remembered? As a time of sheer horror, a nightmare. I don't think I have enough words to describe the way that people feel about what's going on and Palestinians feel about it and how they'll continue to feel about it. Not only those alive today, but not only the adults, but the children. God knows what is going to happen to them, how they will feel. I can't imagine. But it's something unimaginable, this. I can't say it too often. It's not possible to describe this. You can't encompass it, So it's. I think that's probably the best answer I can give.
Okay, we're gonna obviously unpack your story of the Nakba and how you sort of came to be in London and that journey and that massive exile journey, and then again sort of try to comprehend what that exile journey will mean, or what the tragedy and the trauma of what people in Gaza are seeing now would mean. for them. But before we actually get there, you mentioned in your book one state, which was written before October 7th, that the way that Israel was dealing with the Palestinian issue was going to lead to a situation where there is some sort of outbreak of massive violence. In a way, October 7th was that, right? So what are your thoughts retrospectively now of October 7th? And then also, did you imagine that Israel's response would be as brutal as it has been? And then it would be allowed to actually behave in this brutal way that it has?
No, of course not. I know that in writing One State, my book, which did appear in April 2023, there was a section in it in which I had unwittingly, if you like, anticipated what would happen, but not, of course, with the same horror. What I remember saying towards the end of the book is that I ask a rhetorical question, which I say, what if Israel flattened Gaza, just simply flattened it? Who would intervene to help the Gazans? What difference would it make? Who would stop Israel? That was something I wrote before October 7th. But when October 7th happened, it was a dramatic event. I couldn't have anticipated what would happen in those details. But I could not have ever imagined that Israel would have reacted in the way that it did, and it has gone on reacting. By that I mean, I expected, like anybody who observes this scene, I fully expected for the Israelis to respond with violence. That's what they normally do. And I expected that to be the case. Never did I imagine, and I challenge anybody who says that they could have anticipated this, never did I imagine that this degree of savagery and mindless violence aimed at a defenseless population, number one. Number two, that the world has let it happen. We've always known that Israel enjoys a special place in Western eyes, certainly. But for the Western world to be so complicit in something completely outside anybody's experience, so complicit, and to allow it to happen without interfering is something really, really I could not have anticipated in a worst nightmare.
We're going to go back to 1948 now, and this is all we're going to revisit your story to kind of get a sense of what has happened to so many Palestinians and what is still unfolding to so many Palestinians. So in 1948, you were with your family in Jerusalem, and you eventually had to flee to Syria and then to London. What can you remember of that period in 1948?
Well, I can only tell you I remember less than I would have expected to. I mean, I was 8, and so you can't say I was a baby. I should have remembered more, but I don't. I remember trauma, I remember horror, I remember fear, but not the details. And I used to think about that a lot in later life. Why did I not remember with the detail that I would have been expected to remember as an 8-year-old? And I think the answer is that I was so traumatized that, in cases of extreme trauma, you forget, you almost suppress the memories of the events that gave you that trauma. People will say that after car accidents, for example, they can't remember what happened before. It's a little bit like that, and that I think is what happened. But having said that, I recall, of course, a time of fear, of feeling helpless, of not wanting, above all, not wanting to leave our home. Because if you look at this through the eyes of a child, what does a child know? It knows its own house, it knows its little friends, and it knows the immediate circumstances of life. For me, those disappeared in a puff of smoke, and I couldn't take it in. When we arrived in Damascus, where we fled to my grandfather's house, believing at the time that we were there just for a short while, quote, things settled down. Never did we imagine, of course, that would be forever, or at least now for 77 years. Never did we imagine that. We thought, I listened to my parents who were saying, well, we'll just spend a few weeks, everything will calm down, and then we'll go back again. So when we got to Damascus, even as a child, I began to question whether anything would be all right again, because the place was teeming with refugees who had poured out of, particularly northern Palestine, and mosques and schools and people's houses were completely taken up by the refugees, which the people offered generously. And so it was a scene of, like a war scene in Damascus. And even to a child, it struck me that there was something not right about this. And I couldn't express those fears to people around. Everybody was so taken up with trying to survive that there was really, I felt I would not be listened to if I said, look, what is going on, And so my brother and I, he was 3 years older than me, but we were both children, and we were bewildered, as you can imagine, children in any other situation of war, And so, it was really awful. And we spent 1.5 years in Damascus, some of the most miserable of my life, where I was ignored because the adults were so busy trying to survive and to help us survive. Nobody had any time for a child saying, when are we going home? What is happening? Nobody. And so the trauma of leaving, which I carried with me, and I had no way of working through, as you might say, using modern psychology. And nobody was going to work through that with me. And so it stayed inside. And then the next trauma, which is my father left. Now, of course, I knew later that he'd gone to get work in London. And he was preparing for us to join him, which nobody told me. So the next shock was that we all packed up our things and we went to England. As a child of an ordinary family in Palestine, I went no further than Jaffa. So I didn't know anything about the outside world. I certainly didn't know anything about England. And there we were, when I was 9, arriving at what was then called London Airport, wasn't Heathrow, and, and then another life started. So, one has to imagine the accumulated trauma of all those events. Now, I cannot tell you that I ended up in a refugee camp, or that I was physically injured, or that I lost my immediate family. No, that's not true. That didn't happen. But the trauma of all those events has stayed with me all my life.
Do you remember anything about your home in Jerusalem? Do you still have an idea, like what it looked like, the rooms, the memories? And also, what was the story that your parents told you? Because obviously they were protecting you from information. Whether it was a good decision or not, we don't know, right? But what did they tell you? How did they explain what's happening to you?
Well, I do remember things. I remember the house. And I particularly remember the dog we had. We had a mongrel dog who somebody gave us. And I loved him dearly. I loved that dog so much. So I remember the dog, and I remember the village woman. She was called Fatima. That village woman used to look after me and the house. She wasn't a nurse or a nanny of any kind, but I adopted her as a sort of second mother, and I loved her dearly. Now, so that when we left Palestine, the two prominent memories I have is the severance from the dog and from Fatima. Now, it's all in my memoir, In Search of Fatima, in case anybody is interested. And I've described all of that. So that's what happened. Now, what was the story they told us? They didn't tell us anything. They said things like, well, we're just going to go to, to our grandparents' house for a short while, and we'll be back. And then when we came to London, I remember being told, we've got to go and join our father. How long we would stay, was this for good or what? Nobody told us. You see, you've got to understand that in those days, people had no understanding of child psychology or any of that business, and they were overwhelmed themselves. So nobody thought, what about these poor children? Hadn't we better sit down and talk to them and say, we didn't. None of that happened. So we had to kind of make things up, as to why we were going. And, of course, very much the feeling that we were going to go back. There was never any idea that this was for good, So, it was a terrible time.
What was life like when you settled in England? Because you had to start going to school, meeting other children, adapting to the new society. And when did it become clear to you of what the Palestinian story was, what had occurred in the Nakba, and the idea that your own realization that you may never come back or never go back or haven't yet gone back? How did that start crystallizing in your mind? Was it through events? Was it through stories that your family eventually started speaking with, meeting other Palestinians? How did you become aware of what actually had happened?
And I didn't for many years. I know it sounds odd, but I didn't, since nobody encouraged that kind of conversation in my family. I worked out later, much later, that my parents were themselves so traumatized that they couldn't bear to talk about it. They wouldn't sit. I found out later that in many refugee camps, refugee children, the elders would sit with them and say, this was the name of our village, this is how life was, that kind of. None of that happened with us. My parents, I think the best way I can explain it is, A, they were traumatized themselves. B, their way of coping with it was not to talk very much about it, but to get on. Got to get on. My mother was busy making a new home. My father was working. We were at school. I spoke no English at all, nor did my brother. So we arrived, we had an awful lot of challenges which we were not equipped to meet, really. So, Palestine and what had happened and why we were there, it may surprise viewers to hear me say this, didn't feature that much in my early life. Not really, because that life was dominated by having to get on, get used to the new society. In my case, try to learn English. Took me a year. And
That's very quick. A year is very quick.
Yes, but then when you're
Yes.
when you're a child, it's easier. I couldn't. I could hardly learn to manage in the new society, and people also need to understand. Remember, it's not as if we'd left our country and arrived in another Arab country. It would have been easier. Supposing we'd settled in Jordan or Syria or Egypt, it would have been easier. The cultural difference was not great. People, spoke with a different accent, but otherwise it was all culturally familiar to us. But England? Nothing was familiar. It was completely different from the culture that I'd grown up in. And the other thing to remember is that there were very few immigrants in Britain at the time. I'm talking about late 1949, the 1950s. There were not the multiculturalism that you see today and which you take for granted. It wasn't like that. It was very white. And so, to make matters worse, the differences were so great, we spent all our time and our effort trying to adjust and to somehow incorporate the new experiences with those that we'd known.
How did events like the 1967 war, for example, how did that sort of impact your thinking? Did that spark, some sort of effort to try to understand and make sense of your history?
Yeah, no question. It was until 1967, what I've said before, more or less applied. I was learning to become an English child in an English environment. I then became an English university student and then qualified in medicine. And all seemed to be fine on the surface. And then the 1967 war. And this I'll never forget. I was working at a hospital in Bristol. Bristol had been my medical school. And I was working at the time in a hospital there. And I had lots of, I can only call in quotes now, friends fellow doctors, and I was a junior doctor, recently qualified. And I thought, these were friends, this was my community, etc. And then the 67 war. And I remember one afternoon coming to the doctor's mess, as we called it, which was like a sitting room area for doctors, with a television. And my colleagues were standing up and staring at the screen, and I soon joined them, and there was the Israeli army, victorious Israeli army, having destroyed the Air Force, the Egyptian Air Force, and going into East Jerusalem, the part of Jerusalem that remained in Arab hands after 48, and celebrating and putting up the Israeli flag. But the thing that was so shocking was that my colleagues and friends were clapping and congratulating Israel and saying, "Good for you, carry on, give them a kicking," them being the Arabs, And I was shocked, and then, that opened the door to my asking myself some very, very fundamental questions. Who am I, really? I'm clearly not English, because I do not identify with this anti-Arab feeling. So really, who am I? And of course, I knew then and forever I was a Palestinian Arab. I've always been a Palestinian Arab, and I always will be. But one says it now quite glibly, and it all sounds so easy. It wasn't. It wasn't. It was really agonizing, that I'm facing myself and telling myself that I'm not the person that I had thought I was. And actually, not only that, but worse still, I couldn't let myself off the hook. It wasn't just that I wasn't the person that I thought I was, but how the hell didn't I know who I was? So it was more like that, and an anger, that how absurd that I could have possibly imagined that I was English, that I was the same as my colleagues. Totally absurd. And a memory comes back to me. While I was still a medical student at Bristol, and Bristol, remember, at the time was very white, and the Bristolians were very racist. And I tell you, they were racist against the Welsh. I'm not even talking about the Indian subcontinent. One of their first comments when the suspension bridge was first opened, this marvelous bridge between Bristol and Cardiff, they were not delighted at all. They said, you know what's going to happen next? These Welsh hordes are going to come, to us. Anyway, so it was that sort of environment. Anyway, as I was a medical student and I had to have a minor operation, and I went into the hospital, and I absolutely cannot forget this. There was a girl in the same room as me, extremely English. God knows her name was Charlotte or something. And I watched her as her parents came to pick her up. Very English, rather genteel, upper class parents. And they, calling her darling, and are you ready, darling? And so on. And I remember thinking, God, if only I had people like that who felt like that about me, and I somehow belonged. And it just rubbed it in. I didn't belong. I do not belong. But it was not enough. That realization, that momentary feeling of sadness didn't last. It was only the 1967 war that really underlined everything and rubbed it in.
How then do you change the trajectory of your life? How do you then start thinking about how must I now live in a way that I can understand who I am and be faithful? Like you now, it sounds like the sparks within you, a search for your identity and a reconnection with your heritage. How then do you start doing that?
Well, first of all, it took several years. So it wasn't as if I had suddenly had this enlightening moment, and I then ran off with that. No, of course not. I had to unlearn quite a few things, to unlearn certain behaviors, to shed various so-called friends who were not friends really, and it's not easy. And then you say to yourself, well, okay, who am I? Okay, fine, I'm a Palestinian Arab, but what does that mean? What does that actually mean? What is my history? What is happening? Where do I fit in? It took several years of searching, of thinking, and then in the early 1970s, it must be about 1971, it had taken me from 1967 to 1971 to arrive at a point where I knew I had to be involved in my own cause, that it wasn't enough to know that I was Palestinian and that these terrible things had happened to us, but that it was like a calling. I had to do something about it, insofar as I could. And that was the start of a more formal kind of activism, in which I established a couple of organizations and really was a real activist.
I mean, activism, and also you start writing many things. You mentioned earlier you wrote In Search of Fatima, which is part memoir. You mentioned in another memoir, Return, that Stephen Erlinger, I hope I'm not butchering his name, who was the bureau chief of Jerusalem, New York Times, he read In Search of Fatima, and then he realized that his apartment building is on the foundations of where your home formerly was, and then he invited you to go back. What was that experience like?
Well, it was quite strange. Now, Stephen Erlanger was indeed the bureau chief for the New York Times. And what had happened sometime in the 1980s, I suppose, or I think I've learned, the New York Times, somebody had put up an upper floor above our villa, because our villa was like a bungalow. I mean, it was just on one floor. So somebody had built a floor on top of it, and that was leased to the New York Times. So all their bureau chiefs, that's where they live. Anyway, this Stephen Erlanger was the bureau chief of the time, and he was reading in search of Fatima, and from the description, he got in touch and said, I think I'm living above your old house. And would you like to come and see the house? I'd be would like to meet you, this kind of thing. I couldn't resist, of course. And off I went. And there indeed was the house. And on top of it was this upper story with its separate staircase from the garden, which had never been there when we lived there. And there was this Stephen Erlanger, who, by the way, is still around. You can see him on TV every now and then. Anyway, he was very nice. He welcomed me, and we sat and chatted, and not a word from him about how he felt about living above our old house, or, he offered, he said, I thought you might like to see your old house, and I'm friends with the people who now live there, and I've talked to them, and they're very happy to show you around. So I said, okay, right, but before that, I wanted to ask you how you feel. How do you feel about this? How do you feel? You know that you are living above our old house, and you've read my memoir, and you know how we left. How do you feel about the fact that you're here because we're not here? He couldn't answer. He became tongue-tied, and he started muttering, and he really just could not bring himself to answer. So then I said, well, put it another way. How do you feel about Israel? Now you know what happened to us. You're actually living on the physical evidence of where we were, and I can't come back and live there. So what does that make you think about Israel? He could not answer. He would not answer. And it was really painful to watch. He was so acutely embarrassed, I think is the best way to describe it. And, we got no further with that. And so that was that experience, yes.
So you mentioned already that you wrote the book, and you mentioned who Fatima was. Did you eventually track down Fatima and her family? What do you?
Yes.
What's the outcome of that?
Yes, I did. It took me ages, and it's all in my memoir, Return. How I tracked her down and how I found her family, etc. And I can only suggest to your viewers they should read the book if they want to know.
Okay, awesome. We'll read the book. It's very important. Let's kind of, you talk about, and I think in many ways, trying to understand what it means to be Palestinian, you are now in the advanced stages of still finding that out. It's like a continuous discovery, like an onion that continues being peeled. Things happen, many more events like the 1967 happened. Lebanon, the Intifada, the Oslo Accords, the Second Intifada, and then not to Palestinians, but the Afghanistan war and the war in Iraq also happens in the wake of the Second Intifada. As these things unfold, what do you learn about yourself and about your struggle, and about, because now you're heavily involved in activism, you're writing, how does the learning journey sort of continue, and what do you sort of, like if I asked you in 1971, what do you think this conflict's about? What would your answer have been then, as opposed to when, you're in the midst of the Second Intifada, and now you understand it a lot more. There's a lot more elements involved. There's American imperialism, there's Israel, there's the support of Israel, which kind of, continues to this day. How does that what do you learn in that period of 30 years or so?
Well, I tell you, it's taken me all those years to begin to understand what was really done to us in 1948. I don't know how many Palestinians really see it in that way. I think it's so shocking that you have to take quite a time to understand what happened. The fact that I don't live there, and therefore I don't have the daily experience of having to fight against my oppression, has helped, because I can stand aside and I can read and I can think and I can, etc. Okay, well, if I were to tell you, I don't know where to begin. You see, we never really understood Palestinians are fundamentally fairly simple. I don't mean simple-minded. I mean simple, uncomplicated. They were part of the Arab world and had their own lives and lived within the confines of their world, which was really nothing to do with Jewish history in Europe. Nothing at all. They knew nothing about it. And the fact that Jewish history in Europe and the interaction between Jewish communities and the authorities in Europe and larger society in Europe shaped many events in Europe, which in the end led to the establishment of Israel. Now, I would argue that Palestinians could never have understood any of that. They knew nothing about European history, and why should they? Not only could they not have understood it, but by their very nature, by their own culture, they're not adapted to understanding the complexity, the nuances, the intricacies of the Jewish experience of persecution in Europe. So, in all those senses, this was a population that was wholly unprepared for having the imposition of people who had that history, who were the results of a complex, wretched history in Europe, for some of them, not all of them, who were imposed. There's no other word for it. They were imposed on Palestine, on a part of the Arab world, where people are, as I have described. And that is not a crime. Why should people have been versed in the nuances of Jewish life in Europe? That's a European story, which has nothing to do with Palestinians or with Arabs. However, irrespective of that, Israel was imposed by Western powers on this area from which I come. So really, that imposition was extraordinarily evil. It really was. Now, the only mitigation I can think about the British, who actually created the circumstances for creating Israel, the only mitigating thought is that even they didn't know what they were doing, that in transposing a people who come from Europe and who have a load of baggage, in imposing them on an area which is wholly alien to any of these sorts of things, that they thought Okay, well, everybody can get on with it. I don't think they did not understand how Zionism would affect not only the Palestinians, but the whole region and the world. They did not understand that. So I put it another way. If I said to you that we had Zionism imposed on us at a time and in a situation in which we could not have understood it, in which we could not have fought it because we didn't understand it. And so over the decades that have happened since then, Zionism has become clearer and clearer. And it's expressed itself in recurrent bouts of Israeli violence against the native Palestinians and against the region. And it's expressed itself in scheming, in plotting, in the ill intent, the extraordinarily ill intent of Zionists towards the Arab world is remarkable. It's remarkable. These are people who never settled down, who never accepted or understood they were in the Middle East, and therefore they need to fit in. They never accepted that. They remained connected to the West, to Europe and the United States, and they remained connected very much like the Crusader kingdom, which remained connected to Europe. It's the same. They did not ever accept that they were of the Arab region. They knew they were in the Arab region, but not of it. They didn't accept Arabs as equal human beings. And that, in the end, led to this genocide, because that doesn't come out of nowhere. You can only do that to people whom you have for a very long time considered to be non-people. And so you can do whatever you like with them. Now, it's that, you see, to understand all of that is not as simple as I'm making it sound. You have to, all along the way, there were various different ideas about Zionists, that you could actually, there was such thing as a liberal Zionist, and there was hardline, Zionists, and that you could get on with liberal Zionists. That's what underlay the Oslo Accords in 1993. This utter misconception that you can accommodate Zionism, which you just can't. Nobody can. And we've been dumped with it. That's the truth. We're dumped. But this takes, I think, clear thinking, independent thinking, and being unafraid to face facts, because that's really what happened. Now, there's been a lot of dust thrown in our eyes along the way. Egypt signed a peace treaty with this Zionist state, and then Jordan, and then we had the Oslo Agreement in 1993, all based on a premise which is utterly wrong, that you can actually make friends with Zionism. You can't, because Zionism, by its very nature, regards Arabs, dare I say non-Jews, as inferior. That's a fact. And so the idea that you could accommodate Zionism and you could reform it is stupid. You cannot reform Zionism and you cannot accommodate it. So that's what I've understood. And I'm afraid it's a lesson that we've all having to learn the hard way through this genocide.
You mentioned in that answer about Zionism being a war on the wider Arab region, right? And I mean, there's many ways to unpack the devastation it's had, right? One of them is that the Arab world is propped up by a bunch of dictators who are in their positions largely allied to the West so that they can repress popular sentiment, but both local sentiment for their own rights within Egypt and Syria and previously in Syria and in the Gulf states. and also so that you have leaders who are not hostile towards Israel. I'm sure the Arab states, they were also learning, as you were learning about Zionism. This is what Zionism is through their various stages. I guess there's periods where the Arab states behaved in ways which were not so bad, and ways which were very bad, and ways which were sometimes commendable. What's your own sentiment? I mean, do you also harbor injury and hurt against Arab states and how they've responded to the Zionist entity, or is there some sort of sympathy for the fact that they were also unwittingly just, this thing happened? Where do you throw responsibility with regards to them?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Look, we have to start off, and we really do have to say this, that but for the Arab states, I really don't know what would have happened to the Palestinians in 1948. We acknowledge this, and with gratitude, the so-called frontline states, that's those states bordering the new Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and further afield, Iraq, Egypt, they did offer refuge to the poor people forced out of their homes in Palestine. And in the case of Syria, for example, they really had the same rights as Syrian citizens, other than citizenship. And that was a political position, which is that if you give the Palestinians citizenship, then they cease to be Palestinians in a way. So that was a studied behavior. However, for the rest of it, they received free education, they received healthcare, they received somewhere to live. We cannot possibly deny this. And Jordan, at the moment, is home to the largest number of Palestinian refugees. And these things are uncontestable. But for the Arab states, I don't know what would have happened to the Palestinians. Having said that, over time, I think the Arabs made some kind of decision at some point that they could not conquer Israel. They could not attain military victory over Israel. And the big example of that is Egypt. And so, in a way, what's the alternative? We try to make peace with it. And that's what happened Egypt was the first state to make peace with Israel, 1978, 79. And it was followed by Jordan in 1994. Some of the others toyed with and did, in fact, have unofficial channels open between them and Israel. But, having made that decision that they could not fight Israel, they opted for something that really wasn't a good alternative either, which is to keep up a public discourse which was hostile to Israel, but meanwhile accepting and dealing with Israel on a practical basis. That partly led to Morocco, states like Morocco, which had created unofficial channels with Israel. But it also led much later on to the Abraham Accords, which is where the Gulf states went along with normalization of relationship with Israel, guided by the United States. But this behavior was influenced by another factor, which is that the United States was so obviously a supporter of Israel and a defender of Israel. And the United States was the power that these Arab kingdoms, and Arab states wanted a closer relationship with. So really, in a way, they got the message that in order for the US to be nice to you, you had to be nice to Israel. So I remember, in the 1950s, 60s, there was a woman's magazine called Woman's Own. And this had a thing in it where there was articles which said, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. And I'm afraid what the Arabs were doing is the way to the United States is through Israel. And, that's the thing. Now, what do I feel about that? I feel very badly about that, because it shows a fundamentally very poor understanding of what Zionism is, and even worse, the belief that they are safe from the Zionists. You see, it's one thing to say there is this state practicing a particular ideology, which we might or might not agree with. But it's another thing to say. That ideology may reach out its tentacles towards you. That's the bit they don't seem to understand. That the more you prostrate yourself before Israel and its major sponsor, the United States, the more they'll walk all over you. So of course I'm disappointed. I am ashamed at their behavior over this genocide, that they've sat there watching. It's shameful. It's shameful. On what basis would they be watching? Are the Palestinians not fellow Arabs? Are they not in the majority fellow Muslims? What is this about? How can you watch children starving when you've got so much money and so many resources? At one point I used to think to myself, what would happen if they sent a delegation from each of those Arab states and just went into Gaza? I mean, the Israelis can bomb the hell out of all sorts of things, but I think they would hesitate before bombing representatives from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE. Why not go in there and just open the door and let the aid in? Sadly, it hasn't happened. And they sit by and watch. What can I tell you? I feel I am ashamed. I'm ashamed of this.
Do you think? I mean, it sounds like it's sort of like the way they've behaved in the last 20 months is a low for their behavior with regards to the Palestinian cause. But I mean, again, I hear everything you're saying, and I agree with it to a very large extent. But do you have some sympathy for the fact that they don't want to risk a regional war, and that Israel, and especially with Trump and Biden, are in a way out of control, and they need to mitigate against that? I mean, how does that? These are very difficult questions, and just what's your response to that?
Well, I think it's a factor, definitely, and it will have occurred to them, and I don't blame them, because if you look at Israel's behavior and the U.S. Unstinting support, they would be scared, and I think they are scared. To be fair, I think they're afraid. They fear the United States very, very much. They fear antagonizing America in case it retaliates in ways which they're not prepared for. But I would say the major part of the way in which they would be afraid to lose U.S. protection is that many of those regimes are kept in place largely with American help. And so they would have a terrible fear of losing that protection and then facing it. But on another front, it's true. I'm sure that it has occurred to many of them that you might start a regional war, and you don't know how that would end. And their whole experience, the region's experience of Israel, has been that it is extremely aggressive and very belligerent. So, they would be afraid to do that. But you see, I can't fully excuse it, really, because you don't do that when things have happened. You need to anticipate. If if you're a properly functioning state, properly functioning government, what you need to do is to identify the risks around you and the dangers around you and take action to protect yourself. Now, I think they certainly are aware that Israel is dangerous, and they think that they have a protection in being very nice to the United States. But I'm afraid it's very naive. You know, I mean, by the way, most recently, there has been this spectacle of the Gulf states entertaining President Trump. This man has been aiding a genocide. This man is complicit in the genocide of fellow Arabs. Why is he being feted? Why is he being spoiled? Why give him presents? What's that based on? You see, you can't help but you see that, and it's deeply shaming. That's all I can say.
I mean, in many ways, what's happening with the Arab states and what we've spoken about, there's a splintering, right? And I think Gaza and Israel's response to Gaza and the genocide is creating the splintering where Arabs are with fear and with doubts, trying to rethink or not rethink their relationship. They have sort of tried to woo Trump so that, you know, he listens to them in some way, whether that's successful or not. Like you say, it may be naive and silly and stupid, but it's what they're doing, and that's the process that they're undergoing. Where does all of this leave what you speak about in your book, One State? A democratic state for Palestinians and Israelis. Where does everything that's happening, the massive annihilation in Gaza, which is going to have traumatizing effects primarily, obviously, for the Palestinians, but also for the Israelis, because how can a society become so fascist? I mean, that definitely is going to impact the way they think about themselves. And then there's this entire, you know, the world is now, you know, there's a lot more states, even if it's just rhetoric, saying that trying to recognize Palestine as a state. The Arabs, I think, are on notice now to know that they can't trust Israel, but they're still trying to walk this line where they're trying to suck up to the USA because they kind of have to. And the USA, yes, they have always supported Israel and probably will, but I do think Biden and Trump have slight differences, mainly based on ego and how they do that. But I mean, yes, their unfettered support continues. Just where does that leave One State?
Yeah, good question. But let me just say something about Trump having what would seem to be a slightly different relationship with the Arab world and perhaps being a bit different on Israel. You see, I'm not impressed by any of that because he hasn't stopped arming Israel.
Weapons, yes.
In the end, that is the litmus test, really. But that's another subject. Now, in terms of the one state, well, indeed. I mean, when I wrote the book, it was the result of many, many years of having that position. It wasn't new to me. I'd been writing about this since 1990. The fact that there is no end point to the situation between Israel and the Palestinians, except through a democratic state in which Jews, Jewish Israelis, and Palestinian Arabs have equal citizenship and equal rights. There's never been any doubt in my mind that that is the only possible end point to this. Otherwise, you know, what else is there? What? You're not going to militarily conquer the Israeli army and drive out all the Jewish Israelis. It's just not going to happen. And so I'd always drawn up what I think is a very cogent argument for why this has to be the way forward. Because fundamentally, we have a situation in which, whether we like it or not, irrespective of how they came and how they happen to be there is a settler community in Palestine. And the problem with settler communities, like Israel, is that it has no mother country. So, say, take the French in Algeria. The French had a mother country. That's where they went, to France. Our problem with this settler community, is they don't have a mother country. So while many of them, I would anticipate, would rather leave than face the prospect of living with Arabs whom they despise, many of them won't, they have nowhere to go. So you have to find a solution for that, even if you put it in that way, in a very fundamental way, without idealism. You have to be sensible. They're there. But at the same time, there are not only Palestinian Arabs, but there are all the refugees and the people like me who have lost the homeland. We need to go home. Now, it seems to me entirely logical and sensible and practical that the only way you can accommodate the rights of Palestinians and the right of this settler community to remain where it is through the creation of a democracy, a democratic state, which enables everybody to have equal citizenship and equal rights. Now, your next question will be, well, how on earth can we do that given what's happened? My answer is, I don't think it can happen at the moment. It can't, for two reasons. Firstly, I genuinely do not know if the Israelis will succeed in evicting a majority of Palestinians from Palestine. I have no confidence that they won't succeed. Now, I know that's a roundabout way of saying I very greatly fear that they might succeed because that's what they want, and they're being allowed to do it. And exactly as I said in my book, One State, if Israel does such and such, who's going to stop Israel? The same question applies. Who's going to stop Israel expelling Palestinians, killing them, starving them to death, as they're doing now? And the West Bank is very bad. Lots of appropriation, theft of land, getting rid of people, shutting down villages, all of that's going on. So let us assume, we have to assume that there will be enough Palestinians left on the land in order to demand a future for themselves. So that would have to be the first assumption, that there would be Palestinians there, enough Palestinians to make that happen. At the moment, there's roughly 50-50. 50% are Jewish Israelis, 50% are Palestinian Arabs at the moment. So that's number one. Number two is the genocide having happened and the way that Israel has been exposed for this country full of people who support genocide. So we're not, all the time I keep meeting people who are trying to let Israel off the hook. They start saying to you, oh, but there are Israelis who are against all this. Of course there are. They're a tiny fraction. The majority are for it. Now, how are you going to live with people like this? And the answer is you can't. You cannot live with people like that, whoever you are. And therefore, this is not a solution for tomorrow, I would suggest. It's not one that we would discard, not at all, as the ultimate end point of all this. Now, when that will happen, I can't predict at the moment, because I can't predict very much at all about the situation. But when it calms down and it evolves into a position in which we can talk about a future arrangement, it has to be this. There is no alternative. And I say this, with the knowledge, with the sad knowledge that so many Palestinians would feel betrayed if I started preaching about this. They would feel, how do you not understand what has been done to us? How are we going to live with people like this? And I understand all of that. I sympathize, but I just don't see another way.
There's also, I don't also see how the Israelis would want to stay, the ones who are supporting genocide. And so it is a very difficult question. I was speaking to Ben Jamal just on like a few days ago, and I've also spoken to Mustafa Barghouti a few weeks back about what happens to Gaza. And it's very tragic. And in a way, the genocide is unfolding, and Gaza reached a point where a genocide was inevitable months ago. Not now, not recently. And even if Israel adhered to a ceasefire, which it was never going to do in March, it would never have allowed a rebuild. It would have always tried to control the amount of food and resources that are going into Gaza. And so even without the horrible destruction that's going out now, and the fact that people are made to line up in cages to get food, which is not even barely enough, while they wait to potentially get bombed, even with all of that not happening, the fact that the average person in Gaza for the foreseeable future would not have a life that's beyond meandering around rubble, living in a tent, doing makeshift schooling, having makeshift nutrition. And I don't see, like, practically currently what's happening, given global support or global lack of support for an initiative to stop this. It's a terrible question to ask. But is it not, what is the way forward for those people? Is some sort of, maybe we leave and we possibly return or don't return, is that now becoming, I see the problem with that in terms of ethnic cleansing. I see the problem with that in terms of not standing the ground, allowing the Israeli state to take over. But on a human level, what options will the people of Gaza have? Even if that option doesn't even exist currently, by the way. But just how do we move beyond this, just on a human, devastating level? As a person who yourself, 77 years ago, had to leave, not knowing what would happen, and you're still here, and you haven't yet been able to go back. Just what's your thoughts on that, which I think we often avoid. We don't talk about it because none of the options in front of us are good. But just what's your thoughts on that horrendous, nightmarish situation?
Well, firstly, it's to underline that I don't know. I really don't know. This has not happened before. This is unprecedented, and it's not possible to predict. That's one answer. But we always need to remember that Palestinians have always resisted the fate that was written out for them. They have always resisted. Resistance takes many, many shapes and forms amongst Palestinians. All of it is still present, is still as energetic and as active as ever. Thirdly, there is a new factor here, which is the support of popular opinion. The fact that so many ordinary people support the Palestinians throughout European countries, in the United States, and in other countries in the world. This is, in my experience, utterly unprecedented. I've never lived through a time, in all the years I've lived, lived through a time like this, when there's such support, such identification, the need for people to find a way of expressing their support, all that needs to be harnessed. I don't know exactly how one harnesses it, but it will happen. So, in other words, there are factors here which will mean that the future will be affected by these factors. It's not as if the Palestinians are friendless, and it's not as if the weight of world opinion is meaningless. It's not meaningless. It's slow, it's incremental, but there comes a point in which the dam will burst. That's my sense of this. Now, it may be too late for so many Palestinians trapped in Gaza and in the West Bank. I don't know. That I don't know. But that's the best that I can do in terms of looking into the future.
When you look back at everything you've learned over the last 77 years about the world and how it works, What's your thoughts? What have you discovered?
What this long history has done, it's left me with a deep and simmering anger against the Western powers who imposed this nightmare on us. They cynically and heartlessly imposed a complex people whom nobody wanted. Let's face it. They imposed them on us and they dumped them on us because they didn't want them. And that I will never forgive. All our sufferings, all the things that have happened to us, all the things that have happened to us since that moment have been the direct consequence of that Western callousness in dumping us with people who had their own complex history, their own hatreds, their own anger against their persecutors who are not us. These people should never have come into our country. They should have been retained in Europe and amends made to them in Europe and by Europe.
Last question. It's not looking into the future, but not in an analytical way. It's just sort of in a hopeful way. Hopefully, there's many young girls in Gaza who are like 8 years old, like you were once upon a time when you had to flee the Nakba. If you could speak to them 77 years from now, so when they are you, what would you hope to be able to tell them?
Well, I would have to take into account the fact that the trauma they've lived through is much worse than anything I lived through. And I do not know, obviously, how this will affect their thinking, their mental health in the future. But assuming that they will be able to act on advice, I would say to them, number one, you must always remain proud of your ancestors, of the Palestinian people, of the people of Gaza, who never, ever gave up throughout all the years of suffering and persecution. You must be very proud of that, and you must try to live up to that. Hence, you will devote yourself to being an activist for the Palestine cause in whichever way you have any talent for. You must do that, and you must join up with other young girls like you to do the same thing. So you can become a community of survivors who will never, ever allow the memory of Gaza and what it has been through, and the memory of the Palestinians and what they've been through and the way they've come through it, that will never die, that memory. And it's up to you to keep it alive.
Ghada Karmi, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.